Welcome to another episode of the Total Innovation Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Simon Hill. Innovation does not happen in isolation. It's not just about ideas, patents, or technologies. At the heart of it all, it's about people. And at the heart of every breakthrough deal is a delicate dance of partnerships between organizations with different cultures, working styles, and expectations. So how do you build trust and align diverse stakeholders to bring innovations to life? Our guest today knows this challenge better than most. With a career spanning over 2 decades in open innovation, technology transfer, and partnership building, he has been at the forefront of helping some of the world's biggest companies scout for cutting-edge technologies, broker deals, and unlock the power of external innovation ecosystems. He's a Yale and Stanford graduate, an entrepreneur at heart, and a leader who has helped shape how Fortune 500 companies and startups collaborate to solve some of the world's toughest problems. As CEO of Yet2, he has guided corporations through the complexities of technology scouting, licensing, and deal-making, all while navigating the human elements of partnerships, trust, communication, and cultural differences. In today's episode, we'll be exploring Yet2's 3 bands of appropriateness, a framework designed to help organizations understand and adjust to the diverse working styles, behaviors, and expectations that can make or break innovation deals. We'll discuss how companies can move beyond transactional partnerships and build trust-based collaborations that drive real results. So whether you're a corporate leader looking to harness external innovation or a startup founder hoping to work with large companies, you're in for a treat. You'll walk away with practical insights on how to navigate partnerships, build trust, and close impactful deals. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Tim Bernstein, CEO of Yet2, to the Total Innovation Podcast. Welcome, Tim.
Simon, I'm honored and pleased to be able to join you today. Many thanks for having us.
No, I'm looking forward to this, and I enjoyed in the planning behind this, the conversation that we had and piecing this together, because there's a lot of experience here, and it's a very important part of the innovation ecosystems in which we live and breathe. We're going to dive straight in and look at the reasons why innovation partnerships fail, or maybe if we take the positive lens, succeed, right? You've got a lot of experience, as my introduction said. What do you see as some of the biggest reasons why these partnerships fail or maybe succeed? Are we being positive or negative today?
We're going to start negative and then we're going to shift positive because we're optimistic people.
Right.
It's 25 years in this industry, 50,000 deals that should have happened over 25 years at Yet2. And we've been successful. I think we're up to 340 now or something like that. So if you subtract 340 from 50,000, it's not a good hit rate. And there are lots of scars on our back and lots of learnings. Hopefully, we've incorporated and distilled the learnings, and we're starting to be able to teach them effectively and partner well with our clients. And we've seen great ramp up, great increase in our success rates. So hopefully, Simon, I think we end up being positive at the end of the day.
Yeah, and help move that percentage a little bit upwards as well, right? 340 good ones, but I'm sure many more to come, and many more that should have happened. And the loss is the value as well, right? So let's talk around that, right? What are some of the reasons that, I'm not going to do that math quickly in my head, but those 49,000, whatever it is, 900 or whatever, 600 and something didn't happen.
650, yeah. It's funny. There are a bunch of reasons. We've actually built an 8-module open innovation training course just to talk about this set of dynamics. So there's really kind of 8 large buckets there that we turn to. If I was to go to the very top of the list, we have I think a somewhat non-intuitive one that we think is the most fragile part of the whole process of partnering externally in technology. And that's the relationship between the open innovation scout inside our client. So that external facing person whose job it is to go out and find what's possible out there in the world. And we'll talk a bunch more about what's possible in a few minutes. Their relationship with their internal clients with the heads of R&D, with the brand owners, with the product development leads. That Scout's relationship with those internal clients is the place where we see the most number of deals fail, even right up through today, even after trying to coach all of our clients on the fragility of that step. And, happy to get into details about why that internal piece actually is the hardest part of this.
Yeah, it's a good one. I think people may not have necessarily gone there to start with, right? And there's lots of other reasons I'm sure we'll pick up and chew on. Maybe just talk a little bit more about what that means, right? Peel that onion back another layer or two in terms of what you see breaking down in those relationships.
Yeah, and it's funny. We started out, first couple of years were rosy-eyed and all excited, and then the deals start to fail, and then we get more failures, and then you get jaded and all that good stuff. Early on, we talked about things like expectations, culture, and trust, and it was too fuzzy, too ephemeral for me because there was nothing you could point to that a large company could go do differently.
Yeah.
And so we've evolved a lot over time since then. We like to think a lot about incentives. So what are the incentives acting on the various people inside the room, and how do we counter those incentives when those incentives would yield toward killing a deal instead of making a deal? So we think that incentives is absolutely critical. We've also built a concept we call pinches. And by pinches, we mean if you got my name wrong, I'm not going to worry too much about it. But then if you say my title incorrectly and you get the name of my company wrong, now I'm starting to get annoyed at you. And this dynamic of pinches between the large company and the startup or the external solution provider, it is so easy for the large company to pinch the startup. And if that builds up over time, you get to the point where toward the end of the flow from introduction through evaluation into deal negotiation, one of the concepts we talk about when we teach deal negotiation is what we call a ZOPA, a zone of possible agreement. And if the large co has pinched the startup 7, 8, 10 times, the startup's going to be much less excited about sticking their necks out to try to increase that ZOPA, to increase the chances of a deal at the back end. So incentives and pinches are two pieces of this that we talk a lot about. And just to build a little bit further on the incentives, we think about generally inside large companies, you have brand stewards, you have senior stakeholders, you have all of the support functions, legal, procurement, regulatory, manufacturing, all of those support functions. And then you have this poor entrepreneur trying to make something happen at the corporate boundary, aligned against all of these incentives that run counter to getting an external deal done. So we've actually gotten much more clinical. We've applied a lot of game theory, and now we can give very concrete, very specific recommendations about how to realign to increase the chances of deal.
Yeah, it takes me back to some of the conversations even we have with clients where they walk in the room with their senior legal counsel from 3 different business areas and external advisory and ask where ours are. And I say, I'm here, right? And and I'm acting with 57 different hats on in that capacity as, is it even a sort of smaller size mid cap, but like it's a very daunting experience, especially if all you're really trying to do is just get in for a proof of concept to build something thereafter as well. But also, you can set yourself up for immediate failure on that side, right? If you don't really know what you're getting yourself into.
I think we actually counted out the standard set of steps from first introduction all the way through to deal negotiated. And it's like 47 steps across a standard process, 4 main areas of activity, but 47 individual steps. There are lots of ways to kill a deal every single one of those 47 steps.
So we said we're going to tilt into some of the positive sides. And I mentioned this framework, exactly. I mentioned this framework up front, the yet to's 3 bands of appropriateness framework. Let's talk about that. Sounds cool, right?
Yeah. Again, 49,650 stars on our back. Not that I've memorized that number. So when we talk about bands of appropriateness, there's a set of, if you think about the intro to deal process as having these four main phases. Phase one is non-confidential introductions. Phase two is confidential evaluation. Phase three is due diligence, and phase four is deal negotiation. And all large companies have slight variations on that, and they use a lot of different language. But that's actually what we've seen across, I don't know, almost 1,000 large codes now. That's a pretty good approximation of the process they all go through. If you think about the flow through those four phases, from non-confidential intro through to deal negotiation, there's a set of behaviors for both the large co and for the startups that are appropriate. And what we mean by appropriate, we're absolutely using a judgment with that term. What we mean by that is behaviors, actions, activities, questions, tasks that increase the chances of getting a deal done down the road, beyond each of those phases. And then outside of that band of appropriateness, there are two bands of inappropriateness, one for the large co's and one for the startups. And so that's how we got to the three bands of appropriateness. There's actually one band of appropriateness and then two bands of a whole bunch of muck.
Great. All right. And I know I slightly misinterpreted that in my pre-read notes, so apologies, but that actually makes a lot of sense. Which one should we pull on? Maybe let's start with maybe the inappropriateness from the startup side, because it's not necessarily the obvious place to start, right? What are some examples of things in there, and then we'll build up from there back to the appropriate.
Right. So inappropriateness for startups would generally run around refusing to share information, unwillingness to build trust. That's kind of where we see most startups struggling most with bands of inappropriateness.
Is that because of skepticism and nervousness, do you think, or
yeah, there's if you're an inventor, a founder, an entrepreneur, you've heard stories of large companies swinging in and stealing the crown jewels, and then you're this little guy and you can't afford a lawyer, and so they know they can beat on you, right? Those tales from the innovation community are fairly widespread. So a lot of people come in, and a bunch of entrepreneurs have been through this dance before and had really poor outcomes.
Yeah.
So sometimes they're acting directly from personal experience as well.
Yeah, they've already been in the 49,600 and whatever before
yeah, exactly.
Rodeo 2 and 3 is coming around.
Exactly.
And from the corporate side?
From the corporate side, so as I said, the most fragile piece of this whole system is the relationship between the scout and their internal clients. We see lots of issues where the scout doesn't manage the expectations or the requests from the internal clients very well. And so the scout's feeling like, I need to have your COGS and your IP filings and your investment plans and the profiles of your limited partners and your investors. I need that today in order to minimize all possible risk for that brand steward that I'm working for. As opposed to that scout really should be taking that brand steward through the concept of bands of appropriateness and saying, yes, ultimately we're going to need all that information, but today in a first call, our primary goal is to figure out if they have an advantage, what we call a comparative value proposition, and to build trust. Those are the only two things we need to do today. And the rest of this we have to get to, but it's going to be way more appropriate if we do that down the road when we're all a lot more excited about the opportunity here.
When we talk about deals, and I'm going to take us slightly outside of some of the stuff we discussed, because I think it's just worth putting a bit of clarification over what we might mean, right? Like what are some examples, and where do the corners live in some of this broad word of sort of partnerships and deal making?
Right, and I'm almost not going to help very much, because for us, deal is a very broad concept that encompasses a lot of different constructs. But the form of deal that we see most often is usually joint research, where the startup has a really interesting platform, but now we need to prove it in the large co's application. and let's go very carefully milestone our way into a product headed toward market, where the first step might be as small as a $25,000 or $50,000 or €50,000 joint research effort on one key dimension of performance, and let's go prove that startup's platform in my application in that joint research effort. So that would be kind of the most common form of deal, but they can run the gamut all the way from small joint research to investment, to joint development, to full acquisition. So when we say deal, the large co is generally writing a check of some form for something more than just $1,000 of samples. There's actually value being transferred between the two parties.
Right, and a greater level of sort of symbiotic relationship in some way, shape, or form. Great, thank you. And what would be an example, right? You've spoken a little bit of those, but what would be an example of a successful partnership where this mindset of the appropriateness, inappropriateness helped to create an outcome that would otherwise perhaps have not been successful in one of the 340 rather than the other side of that equation?
Yeah, we have all sorts of examples. I have a great example where the large co is an oil and gas player, was looking for a textile ply on top of a rubber substrate for an oil gas application. The substrate needed to bend, and the textile needed to stay adhered to the rubber substrate. And there was this issue around modulus of elasticity and shape memory, and the large co gave a testing protocol, an ASTM requirement around adhesion. So does the textile stay on the rubber substrate at various temperatures and pressures and humidities and all that stuff? And the large co didn't tell the startup that they were going to bend that thing 90 degrees and see what happened. So the startup optimized on a rigid, fixed, linear adhesive to get as strong a bonding as possible across the various ambient environments. And then the large co failed the test and failed the startup because they were bending it and the thing peeled off. And so our recommendation was, let's confirm those testing protocols before we send the startup into the lab to build their custom samples.
Yeah.
Let's confirm those pretty carefully. And the large co didn't want to have that meeting. And then afterward, when the sample failed, and we asked why it failed, and they said, well, because it bent 90 degrees and it completely peeled off. We're like, whoa, we'd never heard anything about the bending. The startup certainly didn't. Maybe we should go back to them and ask again. And now we've started to lose trust already by that point. So that was a negative example where the deal died because the large co wasn't communicating well on fairly simple dimensions back out to the startup. So a big violation of our bands of appropriateness is poor communication when the communication should be easy. Another great example, natural deodorant ingredient. The large co asked for 10 kilograms of a custom sample before they had gotten senior buy-in to the opportunity. And before they had budget available to pay the startup to go build that 10 kilograms of custom sample. So we didn't send that request on to the startup. We pinged it. This is a common tactic for us. We pinged it back to the large co and said, we think these three things need to be in order before we're okay sending that request to the startup. Because if we send it as is, you're just going to diminish trust and pinch them and piss them off. And so we pinged it back. So we forced the external facing scout to go to his internal clients and to those senior stakeholders, get buy-in. Yes, this does look like a really promising alternative natural version. The initial data on it looks great. Then we're all agreed that 10 kilograms of a custom sample, we should be willing to pay $5,000 for that. And so here's budget. We're now empowering the team, go to town, go do the confidential evaluations. And if that looks really promising, then we'll move into due diligence. So that pinging back to protect the large company from their own stepping outside those bands of appropriateness was incredibly effective in that case. And that product's now on market. I'm very excited to say.
Cool, and some good examples of positives and negatives in there from the three different bands as well.
Exactly.
And a wealth of data points to reinforce all of this. I'm going to bridge a little bit now because I think this sort of falls into some of the band thinking, but also perhaps what happens next as well is the human side, right, of this. And it's not a surprise, I guess, to anybody listening to this that, you know, there's very often contrasting working styles and cultures to whether it's a research organization or a nimble startup, and then the large co, right, and their ways of working. So in seeking to bridge those kind of differences, are there tactics that can be employed, and are there things that people on both sides of that table should be thinking about, not just to get you over the line with a deal, but once you've signed something, you've got to start to work and deliver it, and you have to work together. I think that's probably where it's even more jarring, and the reason that even the best deals quite often fail to scale to impact, right?
Right, and we've seen deals where the one or both sides were so frustrated at each other. The momentum of the deal got the deal signed, but then they have to, exactly as you said, they have to work together to get to market, and they're so frustrated at that point that, you know, it was destined for failure, even though the deal was signed.
Exactly. Do you even see? Because one of the things I find slightly bizarre sometimes around the interactions between the large organizations and these kind of things is that a totally different team would work on the deal side than the next side, and so even if you have built great bridges, it almost is irrelevant because that team's moved on and another team moves through. Is that common, or is that, you know, is that one of the things that we need to do more work on between people, or what do you see?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's I think 20 years ago I would have answered this question very differently because I had only been through one cycle of watching a large company innovate. Or large companies, plural. But I've been through like 4 or 5 cycles of how these large companies do this, and they bounce back and forth fairly. We routinely do benchmarking of open innovation systems. And this is a question that comes up every time. The person who built the trust with the startup in getting the deal done, can they now become the relationship manager moving forward? That's a really hard question for a large co, because that person's day job is to go find the next 25 startups and to make sure that either they're partnered with somebody who's internal facing, or that they themselves are very, very tightly connected to their internal clients in that most fragile step of the whole system. And if you're now peeling off part of their time and effort to program manage or to relationship manage post deal toward commercialization, now you have a real resourcing issue. You know, do you ramp up the next person into that scouting role and let this person manage the 3 relationships on the 3 big deals? It's a really tough question for large cos. Where we land on it is, if the deal's important enough, if this is a big enough product launch slot for your brand, and, you know, over their 5-year roadmap, yeah, you probably want to keep continuity of that relationship manager. It's probably important enough to disrupt kind of your standard open innovation workflows to do that. So that's not every deal, but on the big important ones, yes, we do recommend that.
So back to my question before I took us off on a slight tangent. Thank you. In looking to bridge those different working styles, what are some of the, I don't know even know whether we can call them anything more than tactics, right? But what have you seen to help try and bridge? I guess also having a somewhat independent third party in between those helps massively as well, but you don't always have that person there all the time. So what else?
Yeah, hopefully we're helpful. We're net positive. I think so. You know, with the feedback we get and all that good stuff. But so in that middle band of actual appropriateness, there's a whole set of steps that we recommend for the large cos. Toward the top of the list, can you resource somebody external facing whose job it is to communicate something, even if it's a non-communication, even if I don't have anything to say, there's no news, we're still in committee, I'm still waiting on internal alignment. But at least you're communicating out to that startup, and they know that it's not their fault. You haven't rejected them out of hand. It's your internal decision-making process. So that's a first piece is resourcing somebody to be consistently external facing, external touching. And in fact, our best practice would be if you're going to have a scouting function, resource it in two segments. One segment is external facing and the other is internal facing. And then those two scouts, they partner, they sit at desks next to each other every day. They naturally are talking all the time. The internal facing is doing the really hard job of staying very tightly connected to the latest, greatest strategy shifts and nuances internally. And the external facing is doing things like getting back to that startup we haven't talked to in 6 weeks because we're stuck deciding what we want to do to go forward with them. That we find is a really, really powerful structure, internal plus external facing. So that would probably be toward top of our list. Another dynamic, just as an example, and I could talk all day about this. I get really passionate about this topic. Empower that project team that's exploring the opportunity at the edge. Empower them to be able to make simple decisions very quickly. Like, for example, give them budgets before the project starts to go spend $25,000 on samples across 5 or 7 of the best solution providers. Don't make them go internally into the stakeholders and the support functions and the brand stewards and turn that into a 3-month decision process just to spend $5,000 on the first evaluation samples. Empower them early, or at least empower them once you see that there's real intriguing what's possible opportunity out there. So that's another theme we really love around best practices for the large companies.
Great. I guess one of the challenges at the front end of this process, if we sort of walk back up there a little bit, is that early dance, right? That bit between trying to figure, the startup's super nervous, right? They don't want to give too much away. The information in their head, which isn't as protected as maybe the intellectual property might be, wrapped inside a large code, the competitive advantage, the nervousness on, and then this want on the other side of the table for as much information as possible.
Yes.
How do you balance building trust with that sort of IP protection and other things? Again, looking at both sides of that relationship.
Right. So we actually often teach both the large co and the startup simultaneously, and there are two really important concepts here around IP. The first, the large co wants to hold off. It's in the large co's interest to hold off on moving to confidentiality, moving to NDAs, until they're really confident that this is an opportunity worth taking on that obligation of confidentiality of that startup's information. And there's one dimension to this as well. What if they're talking to other startups? And you took on an obligation of confidentiality with these guys, but then you want to go to a deal with those guys, and their technology looks kind of similar, and you have this obligation to keep these guys' IP confidential, and yet you want to go to market with this, and you go to market, and then these guys say, you stole my idea and launched it. Now you're in court, and that just stinks. So this concept of protecting from IP contamination is an important one. Probably more important, and something that we just don't see the large co's talking about today, is this concept we call inventive step. And by that, what we mean is the large co is really, really good at unearthing unmet needs, little known unmet needs out there in their consumer, in their customer marketplace. And the startups, by definition, have found some new to the world, what's possible concept. So when you marry an unmet need with a new to the world technology, that is ripe environment for inventive step. The large co wants to file IP that they own completely by themselves. If you sign an NDA with that startup, you're almost forced to share the IP with them if your technical people and their technical people start brainstorming and you come up with an inventive step new idea. And now you're completely beholden to them in terms of control of that IP and where you go with it and how you compete against your competitor. So the longer you can hold off on that NDA, and then we teach the startups, tell us as much as you can about the what, what does your technology do? What does it accomplish? What kind of data do you have showing its performance and efficacy? But don't share anything about the how. How did you get there? What's the proprietary information? What did you file in your patents? What's new and different? What's the inventive step? What's the uniqueness? Let's not share any of that until the large co has decided that it's worth the obligation of moving to that NDA step. And here's why that's in your interest and your interest. So that concept on holding off on confidentiality until the large co has decided it's worth the obligation, and during that first introductory phase, the startup's actually not taking much risk by saying that we have a 20% performance improvement. They should be trumpeting that from the treetops. That's
exactly
completely non-confidential. So what versus how, inventive step, anti-contamination. There's some really important tools there for protecting the large company's IP interests. And some of those large companies are fairly fluent at, and some of them we don't hear much about. So we're often doing a lot of teaching there.
Yeah, and I think teaching both sides is important. I think there's a tendency to rush to NDA much too quickly, right? And burn a lot of time and energy on that process that, as you've said, delivers very little in that front piece. It might actually cause you more problems down the line rather than the other way around.
We have a great project going right now where the client's looking for alternative seaweeds for an ingredient for a cool application. And we found 9 startup companies with phenomenal new platform approaches to alternative seaweeds. And the large co, so they ran their internal deliberations, took our prioritization recommendations, and said, all right, we want to go ahead with all 9. Can you get NDAs started with them? We're like, whoa, wait a minute. 4 of them are direct competitors with exactly the same platforms. No, we're not going ahead with all 9. And so we had to teach them about inventive step and contamination. And, so they went ahead with NDAs with 4 really different approaches across, with only 4 of those 9. To start with, one of the 4 has already fallen out, so we're ending that NDA relationship and we're moving it on to the 5th company. But it's a really colorful example where the large company got really excited, and we're like, oh, you got to be careful here.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and it's amazing how much infrastructure sits behind the people in large organizations, and when you want it to get out of the way, it's really hard to move, and sometimes when you need it to operate, it's not there, right? To be like that, and so that's really where the value of this type of thing comes in, right? And the real expertise.
You go right back to that concept of incentives. What are the incentives operating on those support functions? They have day jobs, they have KPIs, they have bosses expecting deliverables, and you're not part of that. It's the job of entrepreneur or scout inside the large co. It's a fascinating job.
Yeah, I'm going to muse a little bit more on that, as we were talking through earlier. Of your job is to find more, not necessarily to nurture the thing. I think the incentive there is arguably misaligned, and maybe more parallels between, I don't know, the way that it might traditionally work in a sort of venture backing situation, like a VC or something, where typically the person leading that deal then does take that on and does become a part of the board of directors or whatever, stays close to that thing, and therefore they're picking things that they really want to be involved in and backing. Again, the incentives could be off in some of these scenarios because you may just not care about the problem you're working on at all, right? But still like the business. But there's a challenge in both sides, I can understand. But I feel like if you're handing over the relationship to a brand new team, typically human nature doesn't like that, right? Just because someone's my best friend doesn't mean they're going to be yours if I suddenly hand them over, and that you're going to find the same values in the things that I found values in or whatever. So
it sounds clean on paper, but the human nature of it, you cannot overestimate the importance of that.
I want to pull out, in that 340 you spoke about, there must be some real diamonds, like the ones the ones you're like, okay, if I could just make everyone like this, like, can you talk us through one of those real success stories, and like what, was there anything, was it just lucky, or was there something like that's repeatable from that made that one really shine?
Right. And I could do that. I'm like struggling which story do I tell? Luckily, we have,
which is good. Having so many is great.
We have 350 good ones. So yeah, we're going to end on a positive note here. I love that. Happy to talk about P&G Crest whitening strips. And this is a deal from a few years back, so there's no longer anything proprietary about it. We found a whitening technology, and it turned out the whitening itself, the actives that generate the whitening, that's fairly well known. Not a whole lot of innovation going on there in the pure actives. But how you get the active to stay engaged with the enamel of the tooth for an appropriate amount of time at an appropriate amount of bonding, and then be able to unbond it without doing any damage. That's the trick that's where we're seeing a lot of the innovation in whitening these days. And so we found a technology that had phenomenal ability to adhere at home in kind of standard consumer environments, and then had very easy trigger for unbinding. Our client had been working on this for 20 years, big, very expensive internal R&D efforts, very excited about their own approaches. And yet when we showed the data about, do you only need 40 minutes to get this amount of percentage increase in whitening, and then 98% of consumers can trigger the unlatching in less than 2 seconds with no stress or tension, that kind of performance data should have been really compelling inside our client. And the scouts loved it. So they were, let's get samples, let's run our own versions of these tests, let's do some control studies. And the data keeps coming back that this external platform is looking really phenomenal. And the internal R&D teams are trying to find as many ways as possible to shoot this thing down. So those incentives to getting the brand stewards, the internal R&D senior stakeholders, to getting them aligned around the truth of the science here, and then being able to structure the deal in a way where it was very low risk up front to the large company, to P&G in this case, in case there was actually something wrong as you tried to scale the technology. So we're not committing too much up front to this external partner. So that deal died 3 times. And each time we partnered with the external facing scout to revive the deal. And there were all these issues around budget, around too rich a license, around we found our own internal latest effort has turned a corner now. We're really excited about it. And then that bubble, burst. That was a great example of a deal where we played the bands of appropriateness with the startup really, really well, because we partnered really well with the external facing scout. But then all of the incentives acting on that external scout internally to kill this deal 3 times. Eventually, we had to go to an SVP to override the head of R&D and get this deal done. And it ended up being a $1 billion brand for P&G, one of their $1 billion launches back about a decade ago. So enormous success once you got those bands of appropriateness aligned well.
It's a great example, and also one that, as you said, you had to do CPR on this thing to keep it alive. There must have been huge amounts of nervousness on the side of the research company or the startup as well, that I see this all the time, that they're just running away with my idea, and they'll find a creative way to not do that, but they are just doing that. And no, they're not, right? And it is this internal incentives piece that makes it so hard.
Internal incentives, and we had been rigorously consistent about building trust and being transparent and communicating really well with the startup. So they knew every step. They weren't surprised when the deal died the second time. We had warned them, we can't control this dynamic. This head of R&D is going to shoot this down. We have a path forward, but we're going to have to let her kill it first, and then we'll play our cards there. So the startup was very well communicated, and that building trust and avoiding pinches was a huge part of them sticking around and have the perseverance to get through the fourth round of CPR and then through the deal.
Paramedics as well, eh? It's
who knew?
Who knew exactly? So look, as you said, we could talk for weeks on this, but I'm going to start wrapping us up towards a close. And For folk that want to dig deeper into this, we're going to share some resources afterwards as well. So maybe let's just, we've given a lot in this, and there's lots more that we can do. If I ask you to do the impossible and distill this down for me, right? Some actionable insights for listeners, and let's take that on the side of the corporate and then the side of the startup, right? What's the one thing that a large corporate could do today, tomorrow, to improve their innovation partnerships performance?
Right. I can't just do one, but I did distill it down to 3 for you, Simon.
Perfect.
Arm the scouts to be able to make simple momentum building decisions, in real time, rather than forcing them to go back internally to all of those diverse stakeholders. That's probably pretty high on the list. Resource that external facing function to have a partnership, external facing plus internal facing, because it's 2 full-time jobs. And if you ask one person to do it, they're going to drop critical balls, and good deals are going to die. And then, things like setting aside budget to be able to move ahead quickly. A last piece, communicating well with the startup, even if it's non-communication. So here's what our interest is. I know that seems revolutionary and really scary, but telling the startup why you're interested in them, you'd be amazed how many times that's a controversial decision inside the large cos. So that's, it's all around that, arming the scouts, and then being transparent with the startups.
But I'll give you 1 in 4. I think communication wraps as a theme around a lot of that as well, right? And obviously the resourcing piece. And from the startup side, what's the one thing or more than one thing they should be keeping in mind?
I got down to 1 with Great. The startup. So, my team's going to kill me, but we have a concept internally we call SLCCB, which stands for Standard Large Company Corporate Behavior. And all it means is you're dealing with a 40 or 50,000 person organization. That's 40 or 50,000 different individual sets of incentives, goals, and agendas. Do not think of that large company as a monolith making rational decisions on behalf of the infamous shareholders, the ownership of the company. Think of it instead as these individuals operating in this very complex environment. And if you have that mindset, and then you're going to partner with the external scout to arm that external scout to paint the best possible story for your opportunity, that arming mindset in the face of diverse incentives, that would probably be the single biggest takeaway for startups.
Yeah, I think I would echo those things. I think staying authentic to the business you have as well, and trying to not stick. I know you would echo that as well, but sometimes you try and mirror the business that's there too much, I think. And part of what they want is for you to not do that as well. So listen, Tim, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing openly, for a good, healthy discussion. Your insights into the human side of innovation partnerships, I think, are not just invaluable, but not many people have this much experience of walking this walk, and so hands-on as well. So to all of our listeners, if you're looking to build better innovation partnerships or want to learn more about Yet2's work, head to yet2.com or find Tim on LinkedIn, and I know he'll be happy to connect and share more. Yet2 are also kindly offering all listeners a free copy of their ebook, which you can access in the link shared with this episode. Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Yet2, for that. And as always, everybody, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you did, please let us know why. Share with others, hit subscribe. And Tim, thank you very much once again. And for everyone, until next time, keep innovating. Thank you very much.
Simon, thanks very much for the opportunity.
My pleasure.